I remember the evening I was invited to dinner with my fiancé's parents as if it were yesterday. I was genuinely excited, imagining a warm, cordial meeting where I could show them who I was and why their daughter had chosen me. I dressed carefully, choosing a tailored suit that felt sharp, but not showy, the kind of outfit that said I belonged without screaming it. As I walked into their home, I immediately noticed the subtle signs of their world: or sparkling chandelier, polished silverware, and photos lining the walls of vacations I couldn't quite afford to imagine. They greeted me politely, but there was a stiffness, a careful way they measured me with their eyes. My fiancé squeezed my hand nervously, a silent signal that I sensed even before any words were exchanged. During the initial conversation, small comments started to drip in, like water over stone. "Oh, I didn't realize you traveled much," her father said, and I caught the slight raise of his eyebrows, the unspoken assumption that I didn't belong in their circle. Her mother smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes, the corners of her mouth curling ever so slightly in quiet judgment. I tried to stay engaged, asking about their interests and responding with casual enthusiasm, but each exchange reminded me of the invisible barrier they seemed determined to maintain between us. I noticed other cues to the way they referenced their friends, accomplishments as if to remind me how far I supposedly had to climb. The quiet laughter that stopped when I glanced their way. There was a subtle, almost imperceptible hierarchy in play, and I could feel it pressing on me. I realized then that this wasn't just a dinner, it was an audition I hadn't fully prepared for. I felt a flicker of doubt, but refused to let it take root. I was here for more than approval. I wanted to show them I wasn't just another outsider trying to marry into their world. As the evening progressed, I caught myself comparing their lifestyle to mine, noting the polished veneer of their lives. They spoke about art galleries, charity events, and memberships I had never heard of, each mention a gentle reminder that I was considered beneath them. But rather than shrinking under the weight of their subtle condescension, I reminded myself of the life I had built, my own accomplishments, my financial freedom, my ability to navigate any social circle on my own terms. I felt a quiet surge of confidence, a determination that tonight I would plant the seeds of respect they didn't yet realize they owed me. By the time the first course arrived, I had already decided how I would handle the subtle jabs and quiet tests of character. I listened carefully, replied thoughtfully, and let the conversation flow in a way that was engaging but not subservient. Their world was exclusive, yes, but I refused to let it intimidate me. Every glance, every tiny smirk, every measured comment was fuel for the game I was about to play, and I relished the challenge. The evening had started as an innocent invitation, but it was quickly becoming the stage for something much larger, something that neither my fiancée nor her parents had anticipated. As soon as we sat down, the tension in the room became palpable. The table was immaculately set, and I could feel their eyes scanning me from across the polished surface, measuring me with subtle precision. The comments began almost immediately, thinly veiled but pointed. "I hope your work schedule isn't too demanding," her father remarked, his tone casual but heavy with implication, as if my career might somehow make me unreliable. Her mother chimed in about how some people prefer a quieter life, their words cloaked in politeness, but dripping with judgment. Each sentence carried a hidden edge, a reminder that in their eyes, I was still the outsider trying to step into a world I didn't belong to. I found myself retreating briefly into my own mind, recalling every warning my friends had given me about this dinner. They told me how her family valued status over character, how they subtly tested anyone who dared to enter their circle. I remembered casual comments from my fiancé before this evening, hints about past partners being subtly dismissed, evaluated, and quietly rejected. Those memories sharpened my awareness. I realized that this wasn't just about first impressions. This was a subtle initiation, a quiet battlefield where appearances and social pedigree mattered more than kindness or intelligence. But as I listened, I reminded myself of who I was. I was a man who had built everything from the ground up, someone confident in his success, his wealth, and his vision. They could look down, condescend or whisper behind their polite smiles. But the truth was starkly clear in my mind. I was no one's inferior. The contrast between their calculated dismissal and my quiet confidence created an internal surge of empowerment. Every jab they threw, no matter how refined, became an opportunity to observe, to learn, and to prepare my own response. I smiled politely at each remark, letting my words flow with charm and subtle wit, making sure they didn't catch the full measure of my awareness yet. Inside, I analyzed every nuance, the small flicker of irritation when I mentioned a recent business venture, the slight hesitation in their eyes when I discussed travel plans. I noted their patterns, the rhythm of their judgments, the way they framed every conversation to remind me that I was less than. And yet, the harder they tried to position themselves above me, the clearer it became that their measures of worth were arbitrary and fragile. By the time the appetizers arrived, I had mentally mapped the battlefield. I knew their dismissive smiles hid insecurity. Their probing questions masked fear of exposure, and I felt a calm, simmering satisfaction knowing that I was entirely in control of how this evening would unfold. On the surface, I played the polite guest, nodding, laughing lightly, responding graciously. Beneath that mask, however, I was plotting the subtle ways I would assert my presence, my value, and eventually, my quiet but undeniable dominance over their assumptions. Tonight, I decided, would be a lesson in contrasts. Their superficial superiority versus my substantive power. Their dismissive condescension versus my unshakable confidence. I noticed my fiancée fidgeting slightly, her hands twisting in her lap, her eyes darting between me and her parents as if she were bracing for impact. The longer we sat, the more obvious it became that the evening was not going to be simple. Her parents' questions became sharper, though always coded in politeness. "Do you really think your career can handle the demands of a family?" her father asked, tilting his head with a faint smirk. Her mother added, almost casually, "It must be challenging keeping up with all your commitments, I imagine." Their words weren't outright insults, but each syllable carried a subtle judgment, a test designed to unsettle me. I could feel the weight of their scrutiny pressing down, and I started to understand the unspoken game they were playing. Every glance, every tiny pause before a response, was loaded with expectation and silent critique. My fiancée's discomfort was palpable, and I could see the tension radiating from her. I had always known her parents were protective, but I hadn't expected the level of subtle hostility. In that moment, I realized they might never fully respect me, or worse, my relationship with their daughter. As I listened to their thinly veiled critiques, my mind wandered to previous encounters, casual family gatherings, and stories my fiancée had shared about her parents' behavior. Friends' warnings echoed in my head, how they tested potential partners, gauged ambition, and subtly undermined confidence. It was all becoming painfully clear. This dinner was less about getting to know me and more about measuring my worth, seeing if I could survive their quiet judgment without cracking. The emotional stakes surged. I felt a sharp twist of humiliation, the sting of being judged unfairly, the awareness of social rejection before any true conversation had even begun. I tried to maintain composure, answering politely and keeping my tone warm. But inside, I was simmering with a quiet anger. The contrast between their dismissive behavior and the life I had built for myself was glaring. I had earned everything I had, worked tirelessly for my achievements. Yet here I was, subtly questioned as though none of it mattered. Every question they asked, every careful pause or raised eyebrow, reinforced the social hierarchy they assumed they controlled. Even as I engaged, I couldn't help but analyze the patterns of their passive aggressiveness. Each remark was calculated to make me question myself, to elicit doubt, to position me as the outsider, the one unworthy of their daughter's hand. The more I observed, the more determined I became. This wasn't a simple dinner, it was an arena, and I was already planning how to navigate it, how to assert my dignity without stooping to their level. I knew that to win not just the respect of the room, but the satisfaction of seeing justice unfold, I would have to bide my time, observe, and strike subtly at the perfect moment. By the time the first drinks were poured, the tension had reached a delicate peak. The room was polite, but charged with unspoken judgments. My fiancée's nervous glances reminded me that her loyalty could be tested, her heart caught between her family and me. And in that charged atmosphere, I realized one thing with absolute clarity. This dinner was no longer about pleasantries or introductions. It was about proving worth in the face of subtle cruelty, surviving the social gauntlet, and ultimately, turning the tables in a way they would never anticipate. As the evening wore on, their comments became even more layered, wrapped in sarcasm and insider jokes I wasn't a part of. Every laugh they shared seemed to carry an invisible line that I wasn't allowed to cross, and every harmless remark felt like a test. "Oh, I'm sure your little office must keep you very busy," her father said, smirking in a way that suggested my accomplishments were laughable. Her mother added, "It's amazing how some people manage everything without anyone helping them, isn't it?" The words sounded polite to anyone else, but I could feel the sting underneath, the implication that I wasn't capable of fitting into their polished world. I noticed the microaggressions, small gestures, fleeting expressions, and the pauses that follow each of their comments. They were subtle, calculated, designed to make me feel out of place without ever seeming overtly cruel. I caught the slight curl of her father's lip when I mentioned a recent business achievement, and the way her mother's eyes flicked toward a framed photograph of a wealthy family friend, as if silently comparing me to someone more appropriate. Each moment was a reminder that I was the outsider in their world, measured and found lacking. Despite the growing tension, I maintained my composure. I smiled politely, nodded, and responded thoughtfully, ensuring that my words carried confidence without arrogance. Inside, however, I was analyzing every interaction, noting patterns and testing boundaries. I reminded myself that this was a game of subtle influence, and the last thing I wanted was to react impulsively and give them the satisfaction of seeing me rattled. The contrast was clear. They were trying to unsettle me with refinement, and I was countering with calm, controlled awareness. My mind also replayed warnings from friends and previous anecdotes from my fiancée, all highlighting how her family enjoyed testing partners, seeing if anyone could survive their layered criticisms. I realized that patience was my ally, that maintaining grace under fire would allow me to observe more, gather more insight, and eventually turn the situation in my favor. The subtle cruelty, I knew, was only effective if it provoked a reaction, and I wasn't going to give them that. Still, the question lingered at the edge of my thoughts. Should I respond now, make a small, pointed remark to assert my presence, or continue to let it slide, biding my time until the perfect moment to assert control? The room hummed with polite conversation, laughter, and the clinking of silverware. But beneath it all, a silent battle was unfolding. I could feel the stakes rising with every passing minute, each coded insult and inside joke a gauntlet I had to navigate. And in that moment, I realized that the evening was far from over. The real game was just beginning, and the choices I made next would determine whether I remained merely a guest or became someone who could quietly command respect without uttering a word too soon. By the time the main course arrived, the subtle digs had escalated into more pointed questions, each one testing my composure and sense of worth. Her father leaned back slightly, folding his arms in that familiar posture of superiority, and asked, "Are you sure your career can support the kind of lifestyle we're accustomed to? It must be different." The words weren't aggressive, but the implication was clear. I didn't belong, I wasn't enough, and they were watching for any sign of weakness. Her mother chimed in with a soft, cutting smile. "It's remarkable how some people manage social circles like ours. Do you attend such events often?" The questions carried a silent judgment, measuring my ability to match their status and fit seamlessly into a world they had built for themselves. Inside, I felt a flicker of anger ignite. The polite smile I maintained on the outside barely contained the storm brewing in my mind. Every question felt like an assumption of inferiority, a reminder that they believed they were entitled to evaluate my worth. I replayed moments from my past successes, boardroom wins, entrepreneurial milestones, and personal achievements and contrasted them against the judgment laced in their voices. They assumed my life was simple, unpolished, unworthy of their daughter's hand. The contrast burned in me. My accomplishments versus their narrow, judgmental perspective. My quiet confidence versus their assumed superiority. As I sat there, I began to strategize, mentally mapping out how to navigate this minefield. I considered each remark, each glance, as a clue to their insecurities and priorities. Their obsession with appearances and social alignment revealed their vulnerabilities and overemphasis on wealth, status, and network as the only markers of worth. I reminded myself that their power was illusory, rooted in pride and superficial measures, and that I had everything I needed to turn the evening in my favor. I also observed my fiancée, noting her discomfort, her attempts to soothe the rising tension without openly challenging her parents. She seemed torn, caught between defending me and appeasing the people who had raised her. That internal conflict added another layer of complexity, a reminder that any misstep could fracture not only my relationship with her parents, but with her as well. My mind raced with possible responses, ways to assert my competence and dignity without feeding their perception of arrogance or anger. By the time dessert was suggested, I had committed to a careful balance of composure and quiet assertion. Every answer I gave, every anecdote I shared about work, travel, or social interactions would be calculated to subtly remind them of my accomplishments without overtly challenging their authority. I would plant seeds of recognition and respect, letting them gradually realize that their assumptions about me were not only misguided, but irrelevant. The tension was thick, the air charged with unspoken rivalry, and I understood that the evening was no longer about a polite dinner. It was a test of social acumen, emotional intelligence, and strategic patience. The game had shifted, and I was ready to play it on my own terms. As the conversation meandered toward weekend plans and social engagements, I decided it was time to subtly shift the balance. I mentioned a recent deal I had closed, something that had quietly landed me a position among a circle of influential investors. I spoke casually, almost offhand, careful not to flaunt, yet precise enough to ensure the weight of the accomplishment wasn't lost. I just wrapped up a collaboration with a group of partners in the city, I said lightly, letting the significance hover between the words. Their eyes flicked toward me, just long enough to betray a flicker of surprise, but their faces remained carefully neutral. I could feel the slight pause in the room, the tiny break in their rhythm. My fiancé squeezed my hand subtly, sensing the shift too, and I allowed a small, polite smile to play on my lips. I could almost hear their internal calculations. This wasn't the quiet, inexperienced man they had assumed I was. Their composure returned quickly, but the momentary hesitation had been enough to plant doubt and disrupt their carefully curated perception of superiority. It wasn't an overt power move, and I knew better than to push too far too soon. The victory was in the subtlety, in letting them realize that I operated on a plane they hadn't anticipated. Karma, in its quietest form, was beginning to make itself known. Their earlier judgments, their thinly veiled assumptions about my place in their world, were now juxtaposed against the reality of my success and influence. I could almost sense their discomfort, buried beneath polite nods and measured laughter, and it felt satisfying. A quiet vindication. I let the conversation flow naturally after that, discussing other projects and interests without pressing the point further. The message had been sent, the shift begun. I had reminded them, without confrontation, that I was not to be underestimated, and as the room continued its polite chatter, I could feel a new energy in the air, one that suggested I had subtly taken control, planting the seeds of respect they hadn't yet realized they owed me. It was a small victory, but an essential one, the first moment where the power dynamic had begun to tilt in my favor. As the meal continued, the parents seemed determined to regain the upper hand. Their comments became increasingly loaded, masked as jokes or casual compliments that were anything but. "You must have worked very hard to get where you are," her mother said with a slow smile, I imagine it takes a certain charm to move up in your field." Her father chuckled softly, adding, "Yes, not everyone could handle such responsibilities without a little guidance from people more experienced." On the surface, the words appeared polite, even flattering, but the underlying tone dripped with condescension. Each sentence was designed to undermine, to make me second-guess my achievements, my competence, and, subtly, my worthiness of their daughter. I smiled and nodded along, allowing my expressions to convey politeness while my mind raced. Internally, I dissected every word, every flicker of expression, and every calculated pause. I saw their strategy for what it was. They believed subtle humiliation and social pressure could erode my confidence, forcing me to reveal insecurity. But the harder they tried, the clearer it became that their influence over me was limited. I began mapping the eventual reversal in my mind a way to expose their assumptions, to demonstrate my superiority, not aggressively, but with precision and timing. The backhanded compliments kept coming, each framed as advice or concern. Remarks about the circles I frequented, the events I attended, or the casual insinuation that my lifestyle lacked refinement. I allowed the words to pass, absorbing their intentions while reinforcing my own sense of composure. For every microaggression, I imagined the perfect counter, a public revelation that would tilt the balance and leave their judgment exposed. The evening had transformed into a subtle battle of wit and perception, and I felt a quiet thrill at the prospect of gradually taking control. My fiancé's nervous glances reminded me that my approach had to be precise. I couldn't overstep, couldn't appear arrogant or defensive. The suspense of the situation energized me. I knew that each insult I endured without reaction increased the impact of the moment when I would finally assert my authority. Their attempts to belittle me were planting the seeds of their own embarrassment, and I intended to nurture those seeds carefully, ensuring the eventual payoff would be unmistakable. By the time the next course was cleared, I had a clear mental strategy forming. I would continue to engage politely, listen carefully, and wait for the perfect opportunity to reveal a truth that would subtly, yet unmistakably, upend the hierarchy they assumed was theirs. The tension in the room grew, charged with anticipation, even if they weren't aware of it. In silence, I smiled inwardly, knowing that the balance of power was beginning to shift, and that the moment of reckoning, when subtle superiority would become undeniable, was approaching steadily. I noticed my fiancée shifting uncomfortably in her seat, her fingers nervously tracing the edge of her napkin. Every glance she cast toward me was filled with hesitation, as if she were balancing two worlds at once, one dictated by loyalty to her parents, the other by her feelings for me. Her parents continued their subtle jabs, their questions sharpening just enough to test both of us. "Do you think you truly understand the social expectations of someone in our family?" her father asked, his tone polite but loaded. Her mother added a faint, sardonic laugh, emphasizing the point with a casual wave of her hand. I could see the conflict flicker across my fiancé's face, the silent battle playing out in her eyes. Should she defend me or protect herself by appeasing them? Her struggle intensified the emotional stakes. I could feel the tension between us, a delicate thread stretched taut by their expectations. My mind raced, imagining how easy it would be for her to step back, letting their arrogance dominate the evening. And yet, I also recognized her love, her instinct to stand by me, fighting against years of ingrained deference to her parents' authority. It was a fragile balance, and I knew that how she chose to act could define the tone for the rest of the night. I allowed her small, subtle gestures to guide me, her hand briefly brushing mine under the table, the quick flicker of reassurance in her eyes. In those tiny movements, I felt solidarity, but also the strain of her internal conflict. Every polite nod to her parents, every faint smile masking discomfort, amplified the humiliation I was enduring on her behalf. The weight of social rejection pressed down harder, knowing that she was caught in the crossfire, torn between love and loyalty, empathy and obligation. Despite the growing pressure, I refused to show frustration openly. Instead, I focused on the unspoken alliance forming quietly between us. I let her know with subtle cues that we were on the same side, that I understood the danger of alienating her family too soon, but that I also trusted her to see my perspective. The suspense of the situation heightened the stakes for both of us, making the eventual moments of vindication, when the truth and our resilience would be revealed, all the more satisfying for anyone witnessing our story. Just as I sensed the tension reaching its peak, I decided it was time to quietly shift the power entirely. I leaned back slightly, letting my casual tone mask the significance of what I was about to reveal. Funny enough, I actually invested in one of your family's recent ventures a few months ago. Their polite chatter faltered, and I could see the slight flicker of surprise in both their eyes. I thought it was a smart opportunity, I added, allowing the statement to hang in the air, letting the weight of its implications settle. Their carefully maintained composure wavered for a fraction of a second, enough to signal that my involvement had disrupted their assumed hierarchy. I watched as her father's jaw tightened imperceptibly, a subtle shift that betrayed the shock beneath his neutral mask. Her mother's fingers paused mid-gesture, and her carefully curated smile faltered. They hadn't anticipated that I, the outsider in their eyes, could intersect with their lives in such a meaningful and profitable way. Every polite phrase they had used to dismiss me earlier now seemed hollow, replaced with the realization that my accomplishments weren't just independent, they had touched a part of their privileged world directly. The impact of the revelation was electric. Though I maintained a calm, collected demeanor, I let them process the information, letting their minds race with the implications. The beauty of the moment was in its subtlety. I hadn't boasted, I hadn't demanded recognition, yet the knowledge alone had shifted the room's balance. Their assumptions of superiority, their unspoken judgment, were now quietly undermined. I could almost hear the silent calculations running through their heads. How could they have misjudged me so completely? Inside, I felt a quiet surge of satisfaction. This was the early taste of karma, a gentle, unmistakable reversal. They had attempted to assert social dominance, to question my worth, and now they were confronted with evidence that their assumptions were not only incorrect, but irrelevant. The suspense in the room was palpable, each passing second stretching the tension as they realized that the man they thought they had evaluated was more powerful, more connected, and far more capable than they had imagined. I didn't rush the moment. I let it breathe, knowing the subtle shock would linger. My fiancé's eyes widened slightly, a mixture of admiration and nervous anticipation, and I could sense her pride in my composure. The parents' polite smiles returned quickly, but the flickers of doubt and disbelief were unmistakable, like cracks forming in a polished facade. The evening had shifted. The quiet game of condescension had transformed into a contest of recognition, and for the first time, the rules had subtly begun to favor me. By the time the main course plates had been cleared, I felt a quiet surge of clarity and determination. The subtle games, the coded insults, and the careful condescension had stretched long enough. It was time to speak not aggressively, but with precision, intelligence, and undeniable authority. I looked directly at her parents, letting my calm, measured gaze hold theirs. "You know," I began, my voice steady, "it's funny how easily people assume superiority when they've only seen part of the picture. You've spent the evening judging me, measuring me, deciding I don't belong in your world. Yet, here I am, quietly invested in your ventures, contributing to your successes without any expectation of acknowledgement." Their polite smiles faltered, the room shifting as the weight of my words settled. I continued, letting each sentence land like a calculated blow. "You speak of tradition, of social expectations, of what it means to be worthy of your daughter's hand, yet every judgment you've made tonight has been based on assumptions and appearances. You praise charm, intelligence, and accomplishment, but only if it comes packaged the way you deem acceptable." The silence that followed was heavy. Every pause emphasized the hypocrisy I had just unveiled. Her father's hand twitched, a subtle sign of the discomfort I had anticipated. I pressed on. "You've asked about my career, my lifestyle, even my social circle, as if I needed your permission to exist or to provide. And yet, you failed to recognize that respect, support, and genuine contribution are not dictated by pedigree, wealth, or exclusive networks. They're measured by action, integrity, and the ability to stand confidently in one's own life qualities I happen to possess in abundance. My fiancé's eyes met mine across the table, and I could see the relief mixed with admiration, the quiet validation that we were aligned. Her mother attempted to interject, a thinly veiled protest hiding behind politeness. I allowed a fraction of a second before responding, letting the words settle further. "Please, finish," I said smoothly, my tone disarming but firm. "Your laughter at certain remarks, the inside jokes meant to alienate me, and the subtle favoritism you've displayed, these aren't signs of sophistication. They're markers of insecurity, and they reveal far more about you than they ever could about me." The tension was cinematic, every word landing with deliberate weight. Her father opened his mouth, hesitated, and then closed it again, caught in the reversal I had orchestrated. I could see the flush of realization on both their faces, the quiet embarrassment that comes from being publicly exposed, not in front of strangers, but in a space where they had assumed total control. I had not shouted, I had not mocked. Instead, I had dismantled their assumed superiority with composure, intelligence, and truth. By the time the final courses were served, the atmosphere had shifted irreversibly. Where there had been judgment and quiet condescension, there was now reflection, discomfort, and a subtle acknowledgement of the power dynamic I had claimed. I had turned their own rules against them, using logic, insight, and calm authority to reverse the roles. The evening, which had begun as a test, had become my stage, and in every glance, every quiet reaction, I could see that the message had landed. The parents were no longer in control, and I had emerged, quietly yet undeniably, as the one who commanded the respect that had been denied to me all evening. As the evening wound down, I noticed a subtle shift in my fiancé's demeanor. The tension that had gripped her moments earlier softened into something clear: recognition, relief, and a quiet pride. She no longer glanced anxiously toward her parents, no longer hesitated in her words or gestures. Instead, her attention centered fully on me, her support evident in the small nods, the reassuring squeeze of my hand under the table. I could see that she had reassessed not only me, but her parents' behavior. Their elitism, favoritism, and condescending tone were now starkly exposed in her eyes. She seemed to understand, perhaps for the first time, the true scale of their judgment and how baseless it had been. I remained composed, my exterior calm and dignified, careful not to gloat or overstate my position. Inside, however, I felt a quiet surge of empowerment. The contrast was striking. Earlier, I had been subtly tested, measured, and underestimated, navigating a gauntlet of thinly veiled criticism. Now, the power dynamic had shifted completely. The parents' attempts at dominance had faltered, leaving them momentarily humbled, while I stood firm, aware of my own worth, achievements, and the respect I had earned not through force, but through poise and strategic composure. Her parents' faces had softened, though the remnants of surprise and discomfort lingered. I sensed a begrudging acknowledgement, the realization that their assumptions had been flawed and that the evening's outcome was not what they had anticipated. My fiancé mirrored my calm, aligning with me emotionally and subtly signaling that she had chosen to recognize fairness, authenticity, and integrity over inherited hierarchy or superficial judgment. The silent partnership we shared was a quiet triumph, a vindication not only of my accomplishments, but of the patience and thoughtfulness with which I had navigated the evening. As we left the table, I reflected on the contrast between the beginning and the end of the dinner. Before, I had been an outsider, measured against arbitrary standards and quietly humiliated with every subtle barb. Now, I was empowered, respected, and validated not through aggression, but through the careful display of confidence, intelligence, and moral clarity. The lesson was unmistakable. True authority is earned through poise, strategic restraint, and an unshakable belief in one's own worth and tonight. That lesson had been lived in real time. As we left the dinner behind, walking quietly to the car, I felt a strange mix of relief and triumph settle over me. The evening had begun as a gauntlet, a subtle test of my worth imposed by people who believed that social pedigree and appearance outweighed accomplishment, character, and integrity. I thought back to every remark, every inside joke, every microaggression, and realized how each had been a lesson in patience, awareness, and emotional resilience. I had faced judgment, humiliation, and skepticism, and emerged not only unshaken, but stronger, more confident, and deeply aware of the social dynamics at play. I reflected on the contrast between the man I had been at the start of the evening, cautious, eager to impress, slightly unsure, and the man I had become by the end. I had learned to navigate subtle cruelty without surrendering my dignity, to assert authority without arrogance, and to allow truth and competence to speak louder than any polite mockery. Karma had been served in its quiet yet undeniable form. Those who assumed superiority had been exposed, humbled, and forced to reckon with the reality that appearances and lineage could never overshadow real achievement, intelligence, and character. My fiancée walked beside me, her hand brushing against mine, a small gesture filled with understanding and alignment. She had witnessed the unfolding of respect and vindication, and I could sense that our bond had deepened. The parents' behavior, their attempts at subtle dominance, had failed, and yet the resolution was not rooted in confrontation or humiliation. It was in quiet, unshakable integrity. That realization filled me with a profound sense of satisfaction, a knowledge that true empowerment comes not from proving others wrong in anger, but from standing firm in one's own life while letting consequences unfold naturally. Driving home, I let my mind wander over the lessons learned. Social hierarchies, elitism, and favoritism could be navigated with patience and insight, and subtle power could be asserted without force. The evening had tested my patience, emotional intelligence, and composure, but it had also illuminated the rewards of strategic restraint and self-confidence. I felt triumphant, not in the way of gloating over others, but in the deep, unshakable satisfaction that comes from knowing you've preserved your dignity, defended your worth, and earned respect without compromising who you are. In the end, the story of that dinner was not simply about a contest of social status. It was about growth, resilience, and the quiet fulfillment of karma. The parents had assumed they held all the power, but I had discovered that true authority lies in confidence, insight, and the ability to navigate complex dynamics with intelligence and composure. As the city lights blurred past the car window, I smiled inwardly, recognizing that the evening had ended in a way that was both triumphant and bittersweet, a subtle victory for justice, an affirmation of self-worth, and a story I would carry with me, quietly proud and undeniably stronger than before. As we pulled into the driveway, I felt the calm after the storm, the quiet satisfaction of having navigated a tense evening with dignity intact. Yet, even as the tension faded, I knew the story wasn't entirely over. There were lessons learned, boundaries established, and subtle influence planted seeds that would shape future interactions in ways they couldn't yet predict. My fiancé and I shared a glance and spoke an acknowledgement that while respect had been earned tonight, trust and understanding would continue to grow slowly, carefully, and on our terms. I reflected on the possibility of reconciliation with her parents, not as an act of submission, but as a potential for mutual respect built on honesty and transparency. Their perspective might soften over time, but only if they recognized my consistent integrity and refused to cling to outdated measures of status. Meanwhile, I also acknowledged the need to maintain boundaries, protecting our relationship from lingering judgment, subtle manipulation, or assumptions of entitlement. There was a lingering intrigue in the air, the sense that tonight's revelations were only the beginning of a more balanced dynamic. The evening had shifted the hierarchy, but the game of social navigation was ongoing. I felt confident that the foundation we had established, emotional resilience, mutual support, and quiet authority, would allow us to shape future encounters with strategy, composure, and dignity. Even as the door closed behind us, I couldn't help but smile at the quiet anticipation of what was to come. A life where respect was earned, boundaries were clear, and influence extended subtly but effectively. The night had ended, but the story lingered, leaving space for reflection, future maneuvering, and the promise of continued empowerment.